fall of France had been a disaster to the Allies in more ways than one, and by 1942, they were still struggling to contain the advantages the Wehrmacht had gained. Germany could now employ French harbors to launch U-boat attacks on the Allied convoys traversing the Atlantic Ocean, and containing these naval assaults proved too complicated now that the enemy's navy was not boxed in the North Sea. The French port of Bordeaux was especially precious to German naval operations and soon became a prime target for the Allies. But attacking it directly was practically impossible, as the maritime base was inland, only connected to the sea by the Garonne River. If the Allies launched a naval attack, they would most likely be obliterated by land artillery guns and Luftwaffe warplanes before reaching the port. On the other hand, a covert commando operation was more conceivable, and soon a group of 10 recently formed British commandos was given the excruciating task of infiltrating the most fortified port in Nazi-occupied France aboard canoes. War canoes. When Major Herbert Hasler approached the British brass with the idea of using canoes to infiltrate enemy ports and sabotage their warships in a sly yet devastating covert operation, the British Navy disregarded the idea, thinking it was too far-fetched. Hasler was an experienced sailor and builder of small boats and watercraft, and decades of experience building and sailing canoes had given him an unmatched understanding of how small and light watercraft could be used in covert military operations due to their incredible maneuverability and stealthy nature. He explained in detail how a small group of trained commandos equipped with foldable canoes could infiltrate enemy ports and deliver as much damage as a whole armada, but his superiors rejected the idea. Even so, everything would change when, in December of 1941, a group of Italian frogmen from the Decima Flotilla MAS unit infiltrated the port of Alexandria on board tiny manned torpedoes. The Italian commandos managed to deliver an overwhelming blow to several British ships, including damaging the battleships HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant. After the humiliating attack, the British Navy was forced to see the value of small watercraft operations, especially when dealing with highly fortified and inaccessible enemy ports like the one in Bordeaux. As such, Major Herbert Hasler was called in to plan and lead a new canoe riding force based out of Portsmouth Harbor. Hasler then assembled a team of 34 men, which he personally trained in the use of canoes for combat operations. However, he soon discovered that their foldable canoes were too flimsy and fragile for their intended purposes, and designed and ordered a larger and more resilient model that could withstand the dangers and obstacles that lay ahead. This new canoe was designated Mark II Cockle. Striking the heart. When Hasler felt his unit was ready to accomplish the promised deeds, he submitted an attack plan to German shipping on Bordeaux Harbor, which was widely considered the maritime heart of operations for the Kriegsmarine and an unassailable target due to its location inside the French land. The plan was to deliver 6 commandos aboard a British submarine to the Garonne River estuary, from where they would paddle aboard 3 Mark II Cockles. The British men would then traverse the river by night to avoid being detected and hide in riverside foliage during the day. Once in the harbor, they would approach German warships and plant their equipped limpet magnetic mines on the hulls of the enemy vessels. The specialized mines were designed to work underwater. Although they only carried about 2 kilograms of explosives, the pressure released in the blast was more than enough to carve a big hole in even the most heavily armored warships. Once they placed and triggered the mine, using an ampule of acetone to dissolve the plastic washer inside the device, the commandos had a limited window of time to escape. Once out of range from the local guards, they would destroy their watercraft and travel on foot to a specific French village, where they would rendezvous with the French resistance, smuggling them across the border to neutral Spain. But as carefully concocted as the scheme was, Hasler and his men would face much more perils than they had bargained for. Entering the river. On November 29, 1941, 12 men in a 6-canoe mission took off from Scotland aboard the British submarine HMS Tuna, which would take them all the way to the estuary of the Garonne River. The men were aware of the brutality of Hitler's commando order, that demanded the immediate execution of any allies captured by German soldiers. As such, the young men didn't expect to return, and they assumed they were undertaking a suicide mission. The 6 canoes were named after sea creatures that began with the letter C: catfish, crayfish, conga, cuttlefish, coalfish, and cachalot. Hasler was on board Catfish, along with fellow Marine Bill Sparks. When the submarine reached the mouth of the river on December 7th, chaos immediately struck. Cachalot was damaged as the crew tried to extract her from one of the submarine's hatches, and the 2 men supposed to operate it had to be left behind. Alone and stranded in enemy territory in the middle of the night, the remaining 10 men began paddling silently upriver. They were all carrying a .45 caliber 1911 pistol, a combat knife, and a grenade. The winter gales immediately took their toll on the commandos, who struggled to advance in the freezing darkness. The sea then grew wild and restless, and the canoes were suddenly separated amid the chaos. Soon, the commandos lost sight of Coalfish, and a frantic search began. Conga eventually capsized, and her 2 Marines were forced to hold on to one of the remaining canoes, which took them as close as possible to the shore. The 2 men were left to fend for themselves as the rest of the task force pressed on. Fortunately, they were soon reunited with the lost Coalfish and her crew. As the commandos reached the entrance to the river, they spotted 4 German frigates protecting the estuary. The men then hunkered down, pressing their faces against the canoes and paddling as silently as possible. Minutes later, Cuttlefish was swept by a strong current, but the rest were able to sneak past the German warships without being detected. Only 3 canoes made it to the river, but once on it, they managed to paddle for 5 hours straight, only stopping as the sun emerged on the horizon. Sabotage. The men hid in a separate location as they awaited the night, but when dusk came, Cuttlefish was gone. Her crew had apparently been captured and taken away in the early hours. Even so, Catfish and Crayfish continued upriver, with the 4 commandos paddling fearlessly for the next 3 nights, hiding during the day and fighting against the violent currents of the river when darkness fell. Finally, on the night of December 11th, they reached the Bordeaux harbor, and the 2 canoes immediately separated so that Catfish could infiltrate the western side of the port, while Crayfish targeted the eastern section. The 4 men worked in absolute silence over the next 4 hours and managed to rig all of their 16 mines to several German vessels docked at the port. For the entirety of the nerve-wracking endeavor, the British commandos managed to stay undetected, except when a German guard aboard a warship detected some suspicious movement on the water's surface. However, by the time he was able to fix his searchlight, the commandos had left the area. The 4 men continued paddling away from the scene as quickly and silently as they had entered. After 5 hours of downriver traversal, they finally landed on the shore, destroyed their canoes, and ran into the French countryside under cover of night. The planted mines burst in a synchronized orchestra of destruction 15 hours after they left, leaving massive gaping holes in the hull of 6 German ships, which promptly sank to the bottom of the bay. Aftershock. Despite the mission's success, the entire operation came at a staggering cost for Hasler's men. The Marines who capsized aboard Conga never reached safety, losing their lives from hypothermia. Meanwhile, the British commandos aboard Cuttlefish were captured and executed by the Germans after being betrayed by French locals. Finally, the 2 men aboard Crayfish were captured as they attempted to flee to Spain. They too were executed, along with the men from Coalfish, under Hitler's commando order. Only Hasler and his crewmate Bill Sparks made it safely to the rendezvous point with the French resistance. They were then taken to Spain, where they eventually traveled back to Britain. The 2 survivors returned as living legends 116 days after leaving for Operation Frankton, and were awarded the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Service Medal. Despite their actions being considered beyond valiant and heroic, the 2 commandos were not awarded the Victoria Cross due to a technicality. They were never fired upon by the enemy. Still, their success boosted the morale of the British forces and showed the world the incredible feats a small group of commandos could achieve. Unfortunately, even after sinking 6 German warships, the shallow nature of the port of Bordeaux allowed the Germans to rescue the vessels from the bottom of the sea and repair them. Thank you for watching Dark Seas. For more nerve-wracking covert operations and epic battles that change the course of history, subscribe to our other Dark Documentaries channels, where we publish new content regularly. Stay tuned.